But where are the attendees? Oh. Attendees join us.
Or maybe for the welcome, I'll get closer.
Okay.
Also play around with the camera and
What'd you say?
also play around with where the camera is aiming at.
Yeah.
Zoom.
That's. Hey there.
Hey,
Welcome on, Deborah.
hey, Richard, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Richard.
I supply like this in order to this here, permanent person.
I think it was, we had a registration of 20 people.
Oh, okay. So I'm thinking that most of people might attend Zoom.
Say, is this better on this side? Can you see?
Yeah, maybe if you get a little bit.
Like here?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can get a little bit. What else?
We need to get the owl. Maybe.
As creepy as it is.
So welcome to those who are joining us now for our webinar. We'll give colleagues one more minute to join us, and then we will get started momentarily.
Full day, yeah.
Pardon?
Beautiful day.
Oh, I know. We have a good group here, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Potts. I'm the coordinator of the Climate Heritage Network, and it's my pleasure to be opening today's event, which is entitled Vive Alameda, Habitat 3 Urban Village Project, 6 years later. From a Quito neighborhood to the world, a look at advances in the implementation of the new urban agenda through culture and heritage. Welcome to those who have joined us here in New York City, and of course, welcome to participants around the world joining us via Zoom. As many of you will know, it's been 6 years now since the new urban agenda was adopted at the landmark UN Habitat 3 Congress on Sustainable Urbanism, which was held in Quito, Ecuador in October of 2016. Tomorrow will be the high-level meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, looking at the progress in the implementation of the new urban agenda 6 years later. The breadth and scope of the culture and heritage provisions that were included in the new urban agenda back in 2016 were groundbreaking for that time. And so as the UN General Assembly looks at the new urban agenda implementation overall, we thought it was fitting to shine a spotlight on those culture and heritage provisions as well. And to do that, we've assembled many of the actors who were instrumental in getting culture and heritage treated in the new urban agenda. We'll ask them to reflect on their work 6 years later. As I mentioned, we're here live in New York City, and we're lucky to be hosted in the beautiful offices of the Van Allen Institute in Brooklyn. And to make some welcoming remarks, we have the executive director of Van Allen, Deborah Martin. And so Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. I want to repeat again that we are here from a Quito neighborhood to the world, the Vive Alameda Urban Village Project 6 years after Habitat 3. This is an event related to tomorrow's high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly on the progress in the implementation of the new urban agenda. And I want to say that the Van Allen Institute is honored to host this event for our friends and colleagues from the Climate Heritage Network and also the Metropolitan Institute of Heritage of Quito, Ecuador. And a special welcome to Angelica Arias. Angelica, I don't know if I see you, but I know you were meant to be here in person. And, we look forward to meeting you in person at some point when your passport woes are resolved. So Van Allen was connected to your group through our incredible and super valued and beloved colleague, Diana Araujo, who you'll see in a moment, who was in 2016 a technical advisor to the Metropolitan Institute of Heritage in Quito, where she's from. A little bit about Van Allen, and then I'll pass it back to Andrew. Van Allen was founded 128 years ago. And the mission at that time was to ensure that the civic spaces of our young nation would benefit from the best architectural education available globally. And at that time, the focus was on the Beaux-Arts style. Today, our mission has evolved several times over that more than a decade, more than a century's evolution. And today we work to create equitable cities through inclusive design. So what that means is we share our network, which now includes all of you present in the meeting today, also our more than a century's worth of knowledge on how cities come into being, and our resources, financial and otherwise. We share them specifically with communities that have been excluded historically from shaping their own physical environments. And right now we're doing that in Washington, D.C., in Albany, New York, and across New York City in various neighborhoods. Our work in New York City right now, I want to just tell you very quickly about a project called Neighborhoods Now, which was intended early on to be a pandemic relief project. And it started out very tactical, restaurant extensions and how to redo your HVAC system to be safe. It's now evolved 2 years later to be a more strategic project that works with 7 different communities across New York City to advance their long-term goals. One of the communities that we worked with in this project is Chinatown. And part of that collaboration came out of it was an event called Chinatown Nights. Chinatown Nights takes place in this little kind of forgotten and underused traffic triangle at the base of the Manhattan Bridge. And it became, during the summers of the pandemic, a weekly gathering with a little film screen, with dancing, with food trucks. And the idea was to kind of reconnect across generations and across the many diverse parts of the Chinatown community at this Forsyth Plaza near the Manhattan Bridge. Recently, Chinatown received $20 million from New York State to create a performing arts center, which will be the largest of its kind in the nation, focused specifically on Asian American arts. In its application, Chinatown community cited the success of Chinatown Nights and which was Van Allen's Neighborhoods Now pilot, in demonstrating the viability of an arts-driven economic revitalization. So that connection between heritage, culture, social cohesion, as a kind of foundation for economic revitalization. I understand that that's what all of you are speaking of today. And I look forward to learning from all of you about the strategies that you're deploying across the world. This understanding, in my observation as a long-standing urbanist, of the kind of holistic connection between heritage, culture, and economic development is a relatively new one. And Van Allen strongly supports all your efforts in this holistic urbanism. And we are honored to host you and look forward to learning from all of you today. So welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. The aspirations of the new urban agenda are literally on display here at Van Allen and the neighborhoods around. And so it's such a fitting place to be having our event today. Deborah mentioned our colleague, Angelica Arias. Angelica is the executive director of the Metropolitan Heritage Institute for the city of Quito, Ecuador, a post that she holds today and which she also held in 2016 when she helped welcome all of us to Quito, Ecuador for Habitat 3. And Angelica was to be chairing today's program and addressing you now, but as Deborah alluded to, there was just some infuriating travel difficulties for her. And believe it or not, she's literally in a plane right now, landing at New York Airport at JFK. And so it's unfortunate she's not here because she deserves so much credit for what was accomplished at Habitat 3. I wish we could thank her in person. Typical for Angelica, as she was dealing with those travel difficulties, she quickly made a video and sent it to us so she could at least be with us in that way. So now I'm going to ask her colleague, Mercedes Cardenas in Quito, if she will play the video we have from Angelica Arias.
Welcome to the high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly on the progress of the implementation.
Mercedes, we don't see your screen yet.
Okay. Listen, a minute.
Mercedes, does Zoom allow you to share your screen?
We're trying to share the screen.
Ah,
There we go.
Good morning and good evening to everybody. Welcome to this side event to the high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly on the progress of the implementation of the new urban agenda. Today, we as Quito welcome you to Vive Alameda Habitat 3 Urban Village 6 years later, from a Quito neighborhood to the world. A look at the advances in the implementation of the new urban agenda through culture and heritage. We are really happy to have you all here, sharing your experiences, sharing your knowledge about cultural sites all around the world. So please, let's have a very nice evening and morning here from New York City. Thanks to all of you for being here today.
Thank you, Mercedes. I honestly had a mental image of Angelica making a video in a taxi on the way to Quito Airport. So that was very calmly executed by her. And again, we owe so much to Angelica, architect Angelica Arias, and thank her. So the way that we've organized today's program is into two parts. In the first, we're going to take you back to 2016 and 2015, the run up to Habitat 3 and the Habitat 3 Congress itself, and talk to you a little bit about the intentions and aspirations of culture and heritage actors in those days, why they focused on mainstreaming cultural heritage into the instruments that were adopted in those days, and what they were trying to achieve. And then in the second half of our program, we'll invite other colleagues to reflect on where we are today, 6 years later, in terms of the impact and the implementation of those instruments and the taking forward of those ideas. But to start, we're going to go back to Habitat 3 and reflect on that a bit. And to kick off this portion of our program, I'm really honored and delighted to say that we have with us Francesco Banderin, who's joining us from Paris. Many of you will know that Francesco was for many years at UNESCO, first as the director of the UNESCO World Heritage Center, and then from 2010 to 2018 as the Assistant Director General of UNESCO for Culture. It's also helpful, I think, for you to know that professionally, Francesco is an architect and a city planner. And those that background became incredibly relevant when, during his tenure, the UN system and the world indeed brought its focus on sustainable development at the time of the ending of the Millennium Development Goals in 2015 and the adoption by the world system of a new set of development goals going forward. And Francesco was instrumental in mainstreaming culture and heritage into those instruments. He laid the foundation through important work like the adoption of the historic urban landscape approach by UNESCO in 2011, and leading the efforts that resulted in the Hangzhou Declaration, placing culture at the heart of sustainable development policies, an instrument adopted in 2013. So Francesco is really the perfect person to have at the head of the international culture movement when sustainable development was so much in focus. And similarly, Francesco led many of the efforts in the lead up to and at Habitat 3 in Quito. So we asked, of course, we wanted Francesco to speak today, and we're delighted that he's here to talk to us about culture, urban future, making the case for the role of culture in sustainable urban development at Habitat 3. Francesco is in Paris, I think, today. And Francesco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with all my friends that I see on the screen and to be part and to take part into this event, which I think is quite important because, as the UN General Assembly will discuss, the urban agenda, I think it's very important that the professional community, the civil society that is behind all these efforts, also has a voice. So I think it's important that we have this opportunity. Now, you mentioned that I had this privilege of playing a role in this in the making of some bricks, a few of the bricks of the Sustainable Development Goals and I could say policies, urban policies related to culture. Like, because I have to introduce a little bit the workshop, perhaps to set the scene and say what we had in mind when we started this work, which lasted almost a decade. We're talking about something that we initiated perhaps in mid-year 2000s, when in our work at the World Heritage, we realized that the way in which urban heritage was treated by the World Heritage Committee was not really correct. It was essentially an extension of the monumental view of heritage, and we didn't think that this was a good idea because cities are essentially living heritage organisms. So we tried to discuss and work on this, and I think it was quite an important moment of reflection that in fact originated in many other initiatives. Some friends like yourself, by the way, and Eduardo will talk about some of these the other bricks, the historical landscape idea and other things. But what I want to say to present to you today is why we somehow converge into this idea and document, which we call Culture Urban Future, which was in fact presented at the Habitat Conference, and hopefully also, because of the work that we did before and during the conference, in a way influences some of the elements that appear then later on in the urban agenda. Of course, the environment, the humus where everything takes place. I'm just showing some pictures so you don't fall asleep. Is the Sustainable Development Goals idea. You'll remember that in the first half of the year 2010, everybody was struggling to put its own say commodity in this big basket, and we tried to, and we of course we knew that the MDGs, the issue in the year 2000, didn't look at culture at all in any aspect of policy making. So we tried to have to change this, and we worked quite extensively to have this culture recognized in many of these aspects. Of course, culture is not one of the goals, but that's not necessarily, it doesn't mean that it's not well represented. It is in fact quite extensively represented in almost 12 of the 17 goals. And of course, the one where it's more represented is the goal 11, as we know. That's 111.4 is directly addressing the issue of culture and cultural heritage. So I think it's important that in fact we were able to place culture within this, say, discussion on heritage, on cities. Heritage is also in places that are not urban, but it is true that in fact most of urban cultural heritage, it is located in urban or near urban areas, you know, for obvious reasons, because it's a product of human culture and therefore it's related to cities. Within this effort, we try to play a role in the urban agenda, right? Building on the ideas that had been developed years before, not many years before, through the preparation of the historic urban landscape recommendation, which, as Eduardo will show you, is it's an attempt really to redefine ways in which conservation can address urban heritage, and ways in which conservation can also be seen as part of sustainable development, which at that time was not really so evident and so clear, because conservation comes from a different world and different culture. We try to pack up everything that we had worked in that decade into this document, which we call the Culture of My Future. Is actually, if you haven't seen it, is freely available on the web, and it's still, I think, quite an important report in terms of the effort that is portrayed here. Because we did two things in this report. We did the first ever global study on urban heritage. So we did with 8 teams around the world. We did a study of all the regions of the world, what's the origin, development, meaning, and protection of urban heritage all throughout the world. I think it's quite an important background study, because it gave us a lot of ideas and a lot of resources to come up with the second part of the report, which deals with policies. And this is what we came up in terms of policy. We identified 12. Of course, there could be more, but this is a way to somehow systematize the argumentations, and this deal with 3 elements: the people, the places, and the policies. So each one of them has elements of policy that we proposed as UNESCO to the Habitat 3 conference. Now, of course, one thing I need to say immediately, that we didn't invent this policy. In fact, all these policies are generated by what we found in this extensive examination of the situation throughout the world. So we looked at over 100 case studies, looking at how cities had used culture or cultural dimensions to address their issues, such as, for instance, the creation of mixed-use spaces as a common asset, like in Luang or targeting discrimination and trying to empower marginalized groups through culture, or even in physical spaces, trying to use space as a tool for integration and fight against discrimination, or valuing places that value traditions in ways that fully represent the needs of communities. Also, policies, of course, are very important, because now we're talking about this the future, the next 30 years of the urban agenda. So how policies for development of local economic viability are important, how finance, a new financial tool, can help through the use of culture and traditions, the well-being of communities. Of course, I cannot go into much detail, but I can tell you that this extensive research and study that we've done throughout the world has given us the proof that, in fact, many communities were already using culture as a tool for sustainable development. We didn't have to invent it. We just had to systematize it and bring it to the urban agenda. Now, what you also asked me, what's coming after Cultural Urban Future? Well, perhaps I don't have all the answers. I know that UNESCO is continuing, of course, a lot of work. The World Heritage Cities program has been boosted recently. They, of course, have this very important UNESCO Creative Cities Network, which also, builds on culture for urban development. I was part of a very important attempt to use culture for reconstruction and recovery with the World Bank. The World Bank and UNESCO issued this document, in which, in a way, follows up all the ideas that were, contained in Cultural Urban Future. And also other initiatives. For instance, the one that we are currently developing is the Heritopolis. The idea of studying heritage in the metropolis is something that we will present to the Katowice for Urban Forum in a month or so. So I think that there are a lot of ramifications of the idea that were put in the Cultural Urban Future. I'm sure that the most important one is, of course, the one that concerned the urban agenda, because that's really that was the reason why we did all this, develop all this big effort. There are ways in which we can, somehow systematize the work and somehow make it turn it into international policies. Sometimes we have to look more at the local scene and try to develop local ideas. But both dimensions, the global and the local, have to be seen as part of the same orientation, the same policy. The cities will be in the future, in this century for sure, the place for sustainable development. And as I remember Ban Ki-moon said once, the future of cities, future of development and future of sustainability will be played in cities. So we have to really put cities up front in every dimension of policy dimension that we consider and discuss, including heritage conservation and including the development and promotion of culture. So thank you very much. This was very short, but I'm really looking forward for the discussion that we're going to have today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Francesco, and thank you for your efforts in 2010, 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and beyond to make sure that culture and heritage were mainstreamed into the UN post-2015 agenda, and for your work since then to take advantage of those provisions. Thank you very much. So Francesco alluded to some of the breadth and the depth of the efforts in those days. And following in along with UNESCO was, of course, also civil society. And Angelica had asked me to give a short overview of some of the efforts of civil society back in 2016 and in the lead up to Habitat 3. And so I'm going to do that now. There you go. There we are. So just to reiterate a little bit of what Francesco said, the urban agenda and Habitat 3 really was arising in the context of the broader process of elaborating a new set of global goals on sustainability that would take the place of the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs that had been adopted years earlier. And so just remember that in 2015, we had the Sendai framework launched. We had the launch of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in September of 2015, and we had the Paris Agreement on climate change in December of 2015. And so all of this frantic activity of goal setting was happening in those days. And then Habitat 3 came along a few months later in 2016. So I think it's just helpful to recall that all of these efforts were happening basically in parallel. It was an incredibly important moment in terms of policy development for the world. Francesco alluded to this already. There was success in embedding culture into the UN Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted at the end of 2015. Not as great a success as some of us would have liked, but certainly an improvement over the earlier global goals, the Millennium Goals, the MDGs, which didn't mention social dimensions almost at all. The SDGs, adopted in September of 2015, addressed culture in the context of employment, tourism, education, and then, of course, as Francesco said, sustainable cities, SDG target 11.4. SDG 11.4 is the only target of the 169 in the SDGs that expressly mentions heritage. And of course, it's in the context of cities and human settlements. It posits that strengthening the protection and safeguarding of cultural and natural, importantly, and natural heritage can make cities and human settlements more sustainable, resilient, safe, and inclusive. And one reason it's important to flag this is that when we got to Quito, Habitat 3, we were fresh off the success of getting heritage expressly mentioned in the SDGs, and it was in the context of cities. And so when we then got to the Global Charter on Sustainable Urbanism, many of us were very focused on how that charter, the new urban agenda that came out of Habitat 3, could take forward the idea encapsulated in this one sentence in the SDGs that had just been adopted. A little bit about the road to Habitat 3. Some of you will know that these Habitat Congresses are held once every 20 years only, where the world sort of comes together to assess the state of the art in terms of sustainable urbanism, starting in 1976 with Habitat 1, and then 1996, Habitat 2 in Istanbul, and then on to Quito in 2016. The outcome of Habitat 2 was disappointing for culture advocates. There's very little reference to culture and heritage in the outcome documents of Habitat 2. And so, as Francesco alluded to, going into Habitat 3, 20 years later, the culture and heritage communities were very keen to see the role of heritage better expressed in this outcome document on sustainable urbanism. And we were boosted by the SDGs adopted just a few months earlier that had made a very strong statement on the role of natural and cultural heritage in sustainable cities. On the civil society side, speaking for the International Council on Monuments and Sites, which is where I worked in those days, we took this very seriously. We had global consultations of civil society on how to engage with the Habitat 3 and New Urban Agenda development process, including listening sessions in Bangalore, in Istanbul, in Syros, Greece, in Fukuoka, Japan, and in Florence. So we took this very seriously. We produced a concept note on what we thought are the ways that culture and heritage should be expressed in the new urban agenda, authored by Dr. Jyoti Hosagrahar, who has since gone on to UNESCO, Jeff Soul from the American Planning Association, Luigi Fusco-Girard, Dr. Fusco-Girard, and myself. And we made a focus there on heritage as an enabler of social cohesion and inclusion, culture and heritage as drivers of inclusive economic development, and finally on livability and resilience of cities. And this had a strong territorial planning, urban planning dimension. So those were sort of the focuses that ICOMOS and our partners in civil society had coalesced around in our own parallel campaign supporting UNESCO to make sure culture and heritage were taken on board at Habitat 3. Then of course, we got to Quito, October 17th through the 20th. I had never been to Ecuador. It was fantastic. I highly recommend Quito as a destination for all of you. I have to brag on our booth. We had a booth in the exhibition center, and I'm showing this slide in part because I wanted to show Denise Paredes, who is an Ecuadorian landscape architect, who was one of our leaders in Ecuador, and to brag a little bit on the messaging that we had at the time. I still like this tagline: heritage has always been a key element of urban sustainability, but it hasn't always been a key element of the urban agenda. Now it is. Now, of course, this was before the urban agenda had been adopted, so that was aspirational. A little bit of the flavor of the activities that we undertook at Habitat 3, really just to show you what we were focusing on. So for example, this side event on cultural heritage and creativity as drivers of urban social cohesion, inclusion, and equity. So this is sort of one of the messages that we were sharing, and you see some of the participants there: Angelica, Klaus-Peter Ector, Shannon Miller, and Donovan Ripkema. Another side event from those days: leveraging natural and cultural heritage to improve urban livability and resilience, SDG 11.4 and beyond. So a couple things to note there: focusing on the integration of nature and culture. That was a big message of ours, on the role of culture and heritage in urban resilience, and also tying it to the SDGs. And again, this idea that the new urban agenda could elaborate at length what was encapsulated in only a sentence in the SDGs on the role of natural and cultural heritage in sustainable cities. See Patricia O'Donnell also in these pictures, Ege Yildirim, from whom you'll hear shortly. Some of the folks you'll hear from today back there with us in Quito. And then, of course, there was the Vive Alameda project. Eduardo and colleagues will talk about this much more later in this session, but just to flag now that we were very cognizant that our engagement at Habitat 3 we should practice what we preach. And it wasn't this idea that experts would parachute into Quito and talk about the importance of community engagement and inclusivity, but rather we would start by collaborating with the citizens of Quito, with residents, with local experts, so that we were embodying inclusivity in our own efforts. And that was part of the genesis of the Vive Alameda project that you will hear about later. And of course, Francesco already referenced the launch of the UNESCO Culture Urban Future Report. I knew he would have already talked about it. I mostly included this slide because I love the picture in the middle of Francesco and some of his team launching the report, and also the fantastic event they had, the launch event. And I wasn't sure he would show any home photos, so I wanted to include a few in here. So finally, at the end of Habitat 3, the States Party delegates, the governments of the world, adopted the new urban agenda. There you see the family photo, as it were, of the states parties as they adopted the new urban agenda. So what was in it? Well, at the time, I think we were generally happy that many of the messages that Francesco talked about were taken on board. In the second half of today's program, we're going to talk at length about the express culture and heritage related provisions in the new urban agenda. I wanted to look back and see what we were saying in 2016 about all this, and I found this press release from ICOMOS, which mentions, of course, the groundbreaking recognition of culture and heritage in the Sustainable Development Goals, but then goes on to say that the new urban agenda had reinforced that by acknowledging the role of culture and heritage in urban matters, especially unprecedented, especially in view of the outcomes of the UN Habitat Congresses in 1976 and 1996 that had really missed the role of culture and heritage in sustainable urbanism. So we were quite happy at the time. There were even then some critiques of the new urban agenda. And I include a document here that ICOMOS produced that mentions some of the disappointments about the new urban agenda. And I have a feeling some of these will be referenced in the second half of today's panel. But a few topics that we didn't quite get strongly expressed in the new urban agenda. One is this nature culture linkage and an express reference to landscape approaches and a hull, a historic urban landscape, which we would have preferred. And also it's quite light on the topic that we had really all championed, which is the role of culture in resilience, in climate action and climate change. Climate change was not so strongly at the forefront as it is today. And a few other points. So even then, there were, back in 2016, there were some critiques of the outcome, but generally we were delighted with the strong position of culture and heritage in the new urban agenda. And so I think I am out of time and I will wrap it up there, but only to finish by saying that I think the work that was done by UNESCO and partners in civil society and in the academic community was really groundbreaking and consequential. And it was a pleasure to have been at Quito with so many of you. And I salute all of you that were there for your accomplishments. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to take us now on to look at this to focus more on this topic of historic urban landscapes, HUL, that both Francesco and I have alluded to. There was a strong view of all of us that the historic urban landscape methodology, this forward-looking approach to urban heritage, was really the methodology, the approach that would allow us to realize a lot of the potential of culture that we were championing to the states parties. And so the whole methodology really loomed large in much of our engagement at Quito and our thinking about how to incorporate culture and heritage into the new urban agenda. And so I think it's useful to reflect on HUL and talk about that a little bit more. And to do that, we're lucky to have Eduardo Rojas with us. Eduardo is a Chilean architect and a planner specializing in urban rehabilitation and municipal governance and heritage preservation. He's done many things in his life, including work many of you will know with the Inter-American Development Bank. but today he is lecturing on historic preservation at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. But in 2016, he was also one of the key advisors to the efforts to mainstream culture and heritage into the new urban agenda. And so was with us there in Quito. And Eduardo, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for having me today. And of course, I have to acknowledge that thanks to Andrew, I was lucky to participate on the Vive Alameda project. And I was very impressed about the result of the project. For one thing is that the variety of actors involved on the project. And I still remember when Julia Rey, who was conducting our charrette in Viva Alameda, brought one of the participants. It was actually a 6-year-old child, to discuss the conclusions of the charrette with us. So I say, well, here we are. This is a very widely accepted and integrated element of the community, which reinforced my concerned about the social actors involved in heritage preservation. And this is what I'm going to talk today a bit, just prompted by this experience in the Alameda project. I decided, today to share some of my thoughts about the social actors involved on integrating urban conservation with city development, which is the main message that Francesco was mentioning coming from the urban landscape. So did you see my presentation? Sorry.
Yes, we see it well.
Excellent. So the first thing I wanted to mention just that the historic urban landscape agreement is the inheritor of a long list of agreements, and of course the preceders of many others that come later. I'm just showing the timeline and up to the 2011 UNESCO held agreement. So it's the approach essentially is bringing into the discussion the fact that heritage is the result of the historic layering of cultural values in cities, and that it had to be integrated in the general planning and policy making about urban development, balancing conservation with change, which, as Francesco mentioned, is the essence of urban development. So it gave us a sort of a toolkit, mapping, reaching consensus, assessing vulnerability, integrating, prioritizing, and partnership. And in everything that is in this toolkit, it's lying behind us the social actors that are involved in this. That's why I wanted to focus a bit more on that. We also got the guidebook that was produced by UNESCO. I was lucky to bring my students to work in Cuenca, Ecuador, one of the forerunners of the case studies developed by UNESCO on this field. And that's why I came to see how urban heritage can become an urban development asset for society, and not just the reminder of a long past periods. And I think that it becomes an asset when the intangible and material capital inherited by previous generation satisfies contemporary needs. And this is pretty consistent with the fact that heritage is a modern idea, heritage is a contemporary idea, is a current idea, because what we value is value for the current residents of the city. And that's why they want to keep it in place, because it's satisfying things that they need. But what is important is that heritage had to do this, retaining the attributes that give it its value to society. And this is possible today much more than in the past, because we are much more aware of the multiple values of the heritage, and following the scheme prepared by David Rothby. But in addition to the sociocultural values, which we value all the time, aesthetic, spiritual, social, historic, and so on, there's also economic values, which are the current values of why do we directly use the heritage for satisfying our needs, or indirectly we benefit from those. So the question is that in order to realize those values, we have to accept and there's a growing acceptance today of the concept of adaptive rehabilitation as a valid strategy to preserve the heritage. So the question is that we do now better that because we know more about the process of urban regeneration in which we can balance development and preservation. So I will not go into everything that had to do with these ideas, but I want to focus only on the actors that are involved, because I think we have been sort of very we try to simplify too much the idea of actor by talking generally about stakeholders, but in fact it's a very varied lot. And it comes from a couple of ideas. First is that actors will be interested in different flows of benefit from the urban heritage. And so that, because they are a different interest, they are very different in the way, the attitudes towards the heritage. Scholars and cultural groups probably are very interested in aesthetic values and or historic values, but communities many times are more interested in the social value. That was very clear in the Vive Alameda project, in which they were dealing with what their ways of living and how the urban heritage was helping them to do that. But of course, governments lately are becoming very interested or concerned about the inherited value, how we transfer this to new, to the coming cohorts of society. And people living there are, of course, interested in the use value of the heritage, or developers, because there's business there. The question is how they participate in the process. They play different roles depending on their interest. Some of them will be promoting the preservation, some others will be financing it, whether for different reasons. And of course, many will be beneficiaries. So the question is that actors that benefit from the conservation of heritage, come to reasonism, will be most likely to be promoting it and of course contributing and the implementation of the different actions required. So the idea is how they converge into this process. But also those that benefit and value things will also be more committed to the conservation effort. So they are more likely to become core social actors that will be permanently interested in the place, or very committed, at least. But we don't probably would like to have a sort of peripheral actor that sporadically get interested. So the idea of how increased commitment to the process is critical. So that's why I started searching or researching into sort of the meaning of heritage for actors. And I was start thinking, well, they may have different significance for different actors. And I remember very clearly when in Vive Alameda, we discussed the importance of Teatro Capitol, in which we were meeting for the community. And the community were very sort of happy about Capitol Teatro. They didn't sort of feel that it belonged to him. So I realized that maybe we had to dig more deeply into the significance of the heritage for the communities in order to understand better what we're doing. So, I mean, I give you an example, property owners may experience economic gains or losses because of conservation. So they would prefer probably, sort of flexible regulation in which they can manage and accommodate their needs. Whereas non-resident scholars, talking from the ivory tower of universities, may promote very strict regulations in order to conserve the heritage. That tells you, the kind of differences that we can find in different actors, which finally is Miles' law aphorism, where you stand depending on where you sit. And that's a very important thing to take into consideration. So I divide, based on Schmitters, I devised this sort of scheme of looking at social actors in heritage. So it is not only stakeholders, there are many types of interest holders, from those that hold knowledge, who have information, to those whose life will change depending on what do we do with heritage, which are social actors that are affected like individuals living there, property owners, and many others in which their assets are affected by. That's essentially shareholders. And then, of course, there are people who have special interests, like philanthropists. Now, I would like to mention two of those which I mentioned here. Status holders are representatives of others, which are the city councilors or politicians representing voters, which are the ones that have the right to vote and make decisions whether they allocate or not resources to preservation, give or not importance to preservation. Now, I'm just finally mentioned transient stakeholders, very peculiar definition, but those are tourists. It has a very peculiar and very short-term interest on the whole, but surprisingly, they are figured highly in every decision taken in heritage preservation. The least sort of involved holders end up, being very critical. So I just wanted to mention that in this vast array of social actors, we need to be very careful about understanding their personal perception and interest. So if we build, a big cloud of holders, of interest holders, we can classify them in the different groups, and then, of course, see how they behave in the different stages in which heritage preservation is all today working. At the beginning, the elite was concerned about historic, religion, aesthetic issues, and then you see that the social actors that are involved are not very many, but they are significant. Now, today, we have this situation in most countries in which the government is also interested because of the social and heritage values of the heritage. And then our list of social actors expands. Now, what we're moving now is when the heritage, as Francesco and the whole proposal is advocating, becomes an integral part of the city and of a living city. Well, of course, the number of social actors and values increases significantly. So the question is now, how do we bring all these actors towards the path of a sustainable heritage conservation process based on the concept of the historic landscape initiative? First, by promoting, of course, adaptive rehabilitation as one way of, as a valid strategy, which have a lot of problems, of course, but a lot of potential. Because, well, today we are better equipped to adopt this process because we have better analytical methods and intervention instruments from both historic preservation and urban planning disciplines. From the sportive preservation, we are, allowed, or we can devise today more flexible regulations than in the past, particularly allowing adaptations of the heritage within their carrying capacity. A very difficult concept to make it operational, but we do know more about what it is today. And from the urban discipline, we know better now how to balance the development and heritage, attracting user investors in the areas which are being abandoned or deteriorated, or reestablish the balance in the overutilized sectors. But all of them, of course, trying to avoid or mitigating the ill effects of gentrification or displacement, which is probably a better word today. So this needs reforms on the way we run and manage historic areas, and I think that's a big consequence of the whole. I think the structure of authority and institution to govern need change, avoiding very rigid regulations, trying to use more flexible approaches to it, which is very complicated. We know it's not easy, but it means that we have to think about full conservation for those monuments that we cannot really touch much, into contextual rehabilitation, which is areas in which, or properties in which we can probably intervene more, still retaining the contribution to the heritage. So this is what we call the graduation of the conservation process. But also, we need to avoid the current dispersion of institutions involved in preservation. In many countries, the ministries of, or the entities related to culture are dealing with heritage. Ministry of Tourism are heavily involved in the conceptualization of investment in the area, whereas municipalities or environmental institutions, even urban development institutions, also will need to be incorporated. So this dispersion need to be solved and eliminate the classical dichotomies that we have between conservation regulations defined by cultural institutions are superimposed on urban development regulations managed by planning institutions or others. And I need to use development-oriented decision-making process. The traditional decision-making process in preservation is, well, we value this, we prepare the plans, we found funding for restoration or preservation, we do the work, and then we find some use for buildings or the properties. Well, it needs to be changed. We need to study who would like to be there and how uses we can do for those properties in order to find partners to work with, in which then funding will come not only from the public sector as today, but as a mix of funding in order to make it sustainable in the long run. So essentially, we have to change from this traditional way of doing it into one that actually brings sustainable preservation by united historical preservation decision-making processes towards urban rehabilitation processes. The other thing is we need to coordinate the action of all these actors. You remember that cloud of actors of all kinds in order to find them to work, make them to work together towards the goals of development, change, and preservation. So we need to coordinate the public sector, which, as we saw, they come from different sectors or areas of government, national, regional, and local, and sector, transportation, land use, and so on. So, for instance, the French experience with contract plans is one that we may look at, or corporations, many public corporations, in many ways. But also we need to coordinate the private and the public sector, and that's probably mixed capital corporations or other forms that we have tried many times. And of course, the private practice, what every does in the historic center or historic area, we need to create it through sort of very clear integrated plans. And I just want to finish with a thought that if we get a diverse and committed set of social actors acting in coordination, are our best guarantee for a sustainable conservation process of our heritage areas. And I think that this idea, which is that the essence of the whole, it can be translated into an operational governance structure for our historic centers or historic areas. And that's what probably a view from the social actors side of things will bring us into a better understanding of the process. And I think that I really have to thank again, this little 6-year-old girl telling us what to do in Alameda brought to my thinking. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Eduardo. And many of the concepts Eduardo outlined may seem quite familiar and common sense today, but it's important to remember that in 2014, 2015, 2016, the historic urban landscape approach to urban heritage conservation was more new then, and these were really groundbreaking changes in the proposed methodologies and approaches of cultural actors. And very much these ideas formed the basis of the political and academic program that we took to Quito, and the arguments that we were making to state parties and decision makers on how to think about heritage and how to incorporate heritage into the new urban agenda. Meanwhile, though, as Eduardo very well set out, you can see that these methodologies very much are rooted in stakeholder engagement and participation. And it's occurred to many of us that it would be awkward for a bunch of international experts to sort of parachute into Quito and tout the importance of stakeholder engagement and inclusive processes inside the walled UN compound of Habitat 3, oblivious to what the people in the neighborhoods around the convention center were thinking. And so we had the idea that there needed to be engagement at all levels between everybody involved in Habitat 3, including international speakers that were coming in, but also the residents and local experts in Quito. But how could we possibly accomplish that? And that's really where the magic of Angelica Arias came in. And it was Angelica, among others, who were quick to point out that the actual convention center where Habitat 3 was being held was surrounded by historic neighborhoods. And couldn't we meet with the residents of those neighborhoods and work with them to showcase, but also interrogate and test the very principles that we were trying to sell in the delegate halls? And that was the genesis of the Vive Alameda project. And so now we're going to pivot a little bit in the program today, and we're going to talk about in more depth the Vive Alameda project, which was one of the one of the landmark culture and heritage activities that was undertaken in the framework of the Habitat 3 meeting. And we're lucky to have with us today several of the people that were involved in the project back then. You've already heard from one of them, Eduardo, but we also have with us Diana Arujo, and we're introduced to her already, but I'll just tell you a little bit more about Diana. Diana is an Ecuadorian architect and preservationist with degrees from Quito, but also from the Historic Preservation Program at Columbia. Diana was formerly an advisor to the Metropolitan Institute of Heritage in Quito, and that's when I first met her. But she has also been an independent heritage consultant doing work around the Americas. And today, Diana is working here at the Van Allen Institute, our host in New York. And we've asked Diana if she would take us back to the Barrios Alameda, to the neighborhood in Quito that was our home during Habitat 3 and where we really had the chance to see what stakeholders, what residents felt about the ideas that we were at the same time presenting within the UN Hall. And so, Diana, it's a pleasure to have you. To take us to Barrio La Alameda.
Thank you all. It is really a pleasure for me to present this project. It's very dear to my heart. And I'm gonna try to walk you all through the history and the context of the neighborhood, but also what was the methodology and the outputs and outcomes that came out of this project. So just to start, make sure that you all can see my screen.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. Well, now. Yes, awesome. All right, so I want to start by introducing the neighborhood. And Alameda is one of the 14 neighborhoods that are part of Quito's World Heritage Site buffer zone. You can see on the map, the center is what was inscribed in the World Heritage List in 1978. And Alameda is what you see in the far right, highlighted in blue. It constitutes the limit of the historic center and the connection with the modern city towards the north. For over 300 plus years, since the city's foundation, basically in the 16th century until up to the beginning and early 20th century, La Alameda and its iconic park, La Alameda Park as well, remained the northern limit of the city. And it evolved in a slow-paced urban growth that made it heavily connected to the historic center, less so connected to the modern city. As part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, La Alameda is also part of the city's continuous inventory of heritage properties, which means that every single property, every single lot within the neighborhood, it's part of the inventory. It has been assessed and cataloged and is protected at different levels. The unique history and location of La Alameda, however, has made it a hub of services and public institutions, including medical, educational, cultural facilities and services. It is surrounded by recreational and green spaces on both ends, and on the urban side with La Alameda Park, but also natural side with Ichimbia Park. And this diversity has also been made evident in just the variety of activity and commercial activity that is located in the neighborhood. especially along the main corridor on Avenida 6 de Diciembre.
Sorry, Diana, to interrupt you, but we cannot see the screen, the presentation.
Is that happening for everybody? I'm so sorry.
No, we see it.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
we see.
It's
Yeah.
fine.
All right. Sorry, Mercedes. Just to give you a little bit of context about the demographics of the neighborhood, La Alameda, per the census of 2010, La Alameda total population was a little less than 2,000 people, but it's heavily young and well-educated. And most of the population that you see around the neighborhood are actually visitors coming in for work or to get services from those public institutions that I mentioned before. Oddly enough, perhaps the biggest challenges for the neighborhood are also related to the things that I just mentioned that make it unique. Its location and connectivity, the high concentration of diverse activities, which brings in large amounts of visitors on a daily basis, and the fact that the population is decreasing with younger residents continually moving out of the neighborhood. So this is kind of like the context on how we choose Alameda to work on this project. As most of you already know, Vive Alameda was one of 42 projects selected and implemented in 2016 as part of Habitat Village, an initiative that presented a series of short-term projects and public realm activations designed to serve as a catalog of sustainable development strategies deployed in 3 different neighborhoods in the city. And the main goal of it was to pilot a bottom-up approach to heritage identification and assessment that would acknowledge the community's perspectives and their lived-in experience in order to, on one hand, strengthen the neighborhood's identity, social cohesion, and the sense of belonging as a resource for co-management of heritage. And then on the other hand, to serve as a foundation to capitalize on heritage and leverage local assets as tools for sustainable development. The project integrated a participatory process and strategies throughout 4 different phases that you can see right now, while also combining on-the-ground, hands-on work with digital tools and resources. This allowed us to integrate community members into an otherwise expert-only conversation, intensifying their sense of ownership over their own heritage. I think it's worth noting this project was implemented in a 4-month period between July and October of 2016, which meant that it was very intense, but we were able to run multiple activities, including open call for volunteers, on-site surveying, community workshops, neighborhood activations, and then work on the analysis of the heritage elements that were selected, and prepare a final summit event and share it with community members. So the first action of implementing Vive Alameda was focused on building the capacity and outlining the activities and resources that we'll need to run a comprehensive participatory approach. That meant that we kicked off with an open call for volunteers that led to the onboarding of 28 permanent volunteers working across the project, including municipal employees, college and high school students, and Alameda residents. And that was followed by a community outreach and informative campaign to share the project and ways to participate with residents that included informative sessions in the neighborhood, handing out flyers, hanging up posters, and launching the project's website. Next, we move very quickly into the identification phase, for which we use a combination of on-site tools and strategies. The first one was a physical survey. We deployed a survey. We had 20 of our volunteers spending 3 days in the neighborhood, surveying residents, talking to business owners, merchants, visitors, students, passerby, and collecting almost 5,000 responses that then were analyzed and processed. These surveys were designed to get people's perspectives on what tangible and intangible elements were significant for them. For instance, we asked them, when I say La Alameda, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? And then we classified those answers based on who were responding it to get a sense of their perspective. Then we focused on community workshops. We held 3 workshops with focus groups where community leaders, students, and residents build community maps of the neighborhood, highlighting the spaces and the elements that were significant for them. We co-hosted these workshops with volunteers and community members who opened the doors to their houses to be hosts of these workshops in the neighborhood. And then we focus on activating the neighborhood for a day. So most of the activities up to that point have happened during weekdays. So we wanted to do something different for the residents and activate the neighborhood as well on the weekend. We set up 4 different locations within the neighborhood and engaged community members through a series of activities and games. Essentially, we were asking the same question, just with different tools, but we were also lucky enough that we were able to bring in music and performing arts to make it fun for residents to come out and talk to us. Through it all, we also used the project's website to engage more broadly. We had an ongoing call for volunteers, information about the project and the neighborhood, and a simple 2-question survey that was looking at the same big picture question. The results of this was a list of 10 tangible and intangible elements that were significant for the community. Some of these elements were already part of their collective memory of the neighborhood and part of the heritage inventory of the city, but some were new and very different, like the lagoon or the traditional food that you can find in the neighborhood. So for the next phase, we work on studying and documenting the top 10 elements that came out of this process. For this, we work with a team of 5 local professionals with backgrounds in heritage preservation, culture, and urban development, and a team of international professionals that were coming to the conference in documenting not only the historic and cultural value of these elements, but also its potential as an asset for development. The products of that collaboration were captured on the project's website, physical and digital maps, signage totems that were placed temporarily across the neighborhood as physical markers for passerbys and community members to engage with. And then all of this designing and fabricating kind of like leading to the next phase, for which we spent 4 weeks showcasing the results of the work to the public. So 11 signage totems were fabricated and located near or next to the elements identified. They incorporated a QR code that was unique for each element with a link to the website and a neighborhood map showing where the other elements were located as well. The project website was updated to reflect the progress and results of previous phases. These included 10 microsites, 1 per element, again, with social media features that allow people who are visiting the site to leave a comment or to share with friends. And we also printed around 2,500 physical maps that folded up into a pocket-sized pamphlet, and we gave those away during the conference. For the final phase of the project, we wanted to bring back the idea of leveraging these elements as tools for development. And we wanted to do that through a charrette that will include community members, international professionals, the Vive Alameda team and volunteers, and other municipal stakeholders that had been part of the process. So on October 20th, we hosted a 2-part summit event in the neighborhood. In the afternoon, the community members, international professionals, the team, the volunteers, we all gathered together for a charrette and a workshop. And at night, all participants joined a neighborhood party where local small businesses had booths and local artists performed. So just to walk you through what happened in the workshop, the core of it, participants split into 5 different groups. Each group looked at 2 of those elements within a category. So group 1, for instance, focused on heritage and landscape and look at how could it be possible to leverage the parks of Alameda and Ichimbia. Group 2 look at intangible heritage, the lagoon within the park and the typical or traditional food that you can find. Group 3 look at urban and architectural heritage, looking at the monuments and the properties that belong to modern architecture, but also the streetscape of the neighborhood. Group 4 look at monuments and historic landmarks, and 2 of those elements are also located in the park, but are very iconic in people's memory. And Group 5 looked into build heritage beyond its container, look at the function, how does these values beyond container are reflected in the neighborhood. And for that, they look at a church and the maternity located within the neighborhood. At the tables, the groups discuss the challenges, the potential, and the expectations of the community surrounding each one of these elements, and they define actions, priorities, responsibilities, and the level of impact of leveraging this element. So again, I just want to give you guys a quick example. Group 1 discussed the needs for better lighting and accessibility to Alameda Park, identified its potential as a tourist attraction, social infrastructure, and a green space for the community members. And so they heard about stewardship models from the international participants that were part of the group and defined preliminary actions, responsibilities, and an impact level that you can see there. The results of the charrette were documented and shared with the community and local government agencies, leading towards a more cohesive approach for intervention in the neighborhood and more responsible action plans. Sorry. So for instance, you can see here a picture of La Alameda Park. The municipality, after receiving the results, coordinated efforts with community members to put in place a maintenance plans based on co-responsibility over the space that planned to be a pilot for the stewardship of the park. Or you can see here on Avenida 6 de Diciembre, right in front of Teatro Capital, where accessibility challenges identified by community members within the charrette guided the redesign and implementation of improved sidewalk, public transportation stations, and crossing paths, and removing barriers that existed and just making it a more friendly, pedestrian-friendly area, focusing on the safety of the community. And I guess finally, I just want to mention that the participatory approach of the project became also the backbone of subsequent planning efforts for the Historic Center of Quito. This, that you can see, and you're going to hear more about later on, resulted in the first planning tool for the Historic Center that incorporated a participatory planning process and a comprehensive approach that looked at not only the historic preservation of the site, but also its urban and socioeconomic development. And that's it. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Diana. You covered so much in a short period of time. I think this has been said, but I just want to underscore that this is the neighborhood where the Habitat 3 Congress was held. These residents looked out of their house and saw the barbed wire that surrounded the UN zone, and behind it, the convention center, where 40,000 delegates and ministers of urbanism and whatnot were debating sustainable urbanism. And I don't know that I have ever seen at any international UN meeting a project that more effectively presented and interpreted the heritage of the neighborhood where the meeting was being held to the delegates. I mean, you couldn't walk to the Habitat 3 Congress without passing one of the signs that Deanna showed. I saw so many delegates in the convention floor holding those fold-out maps that gave you a tour of the adjacent neighborhood. So it was really just a brilliant showcasing of the concepts we were presenting to the delegates, utilizing the adjacent historic neighborhoods. But as Deanna said, the point of the Vive Alameda project wasn't only or even mostly to inform the delegates, it was also to have a legacy for the residents of those of that neighborhood. And so now 6 years later, we were curious what has been the impact and the legacy of the Vive Alameda project for the residents, for the city of Quito. And I'm happy to be able to now introduce to you Mercedes Cadenas from the municipal government of the city of Quito. And Mercedes, we're curious, what is happening in Vive Alameda today? What has been the legacy of the Habitat 3 project?
Oh, she's muted.
Good morning to everybody. Right now, I'm going to present you the project and all the lessons that we have learned of this Alameda project. Good morning to everybody. First of all, I would like to extend Angelica's greetings and apologies for not being able to attend this event due to some logistic issues. I am very happy to represent her and the city of Quito and be able to share what we have been doing to revitalize the cultural heritage, as well as tell you about the importance of working together with the community and also with international networks. Quito is the capital of Ecuador in South America. It's located in a narrow, elongated valley with a population currently reaching 3 million inhabitants. We know it is increasingly important to connect and work with these people to protect and value our cultural heritage. As you know, Quito was inscribed in the World Heritage List in 1978 and was the first city together with Krakow to enter the World Heritage List more than 40 years ago. Vehicular traffic pollution and the difficulty to invest in the historic city has set the population projections to a negative %. This could be a dangerous tendency and that needs to be reverted, and is one of the starting challenges that we have for our current plans of the city. Some of the reasons that have triggered these conditions are poor living conditions, insecurity, reduced sources of transportation, social problems, and the high cost of heritage maintenance. With the lessons learned in the Alameda project in Quito, we use this methodology in the participatory construction of the Historical Center Development Plan, the one that talked before Diana, working with more than 14 neighborhoods. We realize that the base of building a plan is the recognition of the different stakeholders of the historical city as bearers of the history and identity. We started knowing and integrating the community of the neighborhood through participatory processes and then through the recognition of their heritage, identity, and appropriation. The dialogue also allowed us to have a sustainable tool for urban development, which includes the integration of all the stakeholders of the territory through integrational practices and set methodologies in recommendations like UNESCO Historic Urban Landscape and the methodologies building bridges for participatory planning that are also located in the SDGs. Knowing this and all the lessons learned in the Alameda project, we have started meeting with the community and neighborhood in order to map the problematic and the opportunities, to share the work among the neighbors, to establish points of interest and landmarks, to know the community that already led initiatives to develop projects, to establish spaces of current conflict, and to recognize current programs, for example, community-led tourism routes. We started the community participation asking this important question: how do you want the historic center to be in the future? Most of them answered: safe, organized, cultural, rehabilitated. These answers are directly related to 11.4, which aims to strengthen the efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. Right now, Quito is moving toward the concretization of this target with a strong basis in the alliances between all the players in the city to develop a network that establishes shared responsibility, efforts to protect and safeguard with a historic urban landscape vision. This led us to build the vision of the historic plan, which is to promote the livable and safe historic center that keeps its heritage alive by strengthening the community of diverse neighborhoods in all-inclusive productive and sustainable rehabilitation shifts. We also want to share with you some of the achievements of this methodology. It recognizes and respects the knowledge of the community regarding its city, its history, and its values, including them in the city decision progress, making them sustainable. This kind of project broke the barrier that for many years have been rising between communities, proposes and open a respectful dialogue. Finally, I have to say that this methodology legitimizes racial, cultural, ethnical diversity and recognizes it as a fundamental pillar of the historic construction of society. Right now, I want to share with you a short video of the plan which explains the principal actions, the program, and the project of this plan that we construct with participatory project.
The strategic proposal of Quito's Historic Center Integral Development Plan seeks to improve the conditions of existing inhabitants and to engage owners, users, and all actors operating in the area declared World Heritage Plan. The plan is divided into 4 main axes, each one tending to improve the quality of life for those living and carrying out their activities in the heart of the city. The first axis of the plan promotes sustainable mobility through projects like recovery of pedestrian stairs, public parking spots in the buffer zone, connection to the Vive Quito public bicycle district system, conservation of peripheral green areas, a central recicla recycling initiative, and safe streets. This is Pablo Naranjo. He works in the Arenas market. Pablo says that the idea to regenerate La Guaragua came from the different actors of the area who saw the need to recover this part of the city. Everyone called the symbolic zone Chuquita Quiteño, but only a few knew of La Guaragua's deterioration and destruction. Pablo affirms that the intervention and improvement of La Guaragua is the best thing that could have happened to the historic center. The second axis of the plan aims to boost the local population social capacity through projects like equipment for social cohesion and the neighborhood, safeguarding immaterial cultural heritage, neighborhood tourism, training programs for small and medium-scale businesses, denominated in Marcha Patrimonial. This is Javier Escobar, and took part in the project of Marcha Patrimonial, a 3-month comprehensive program which, through training and technical assistance, fortifies the abilities and competencies of the business owners working within the context of social and solidarity-based economies. The third axis of the plan seeks to decrease the vulnerability of the buildings of the historic center through projects like Metropolitan Information System for Cultural Heritage Properties, Nueva Escuela Taller, monumental architecture interventions, rehabilitation of municipal properties for housing, and incentives for rehabilitating private property. Silvana Rivadeneira Arcos lives in the historic center and runs a tourist business. In order to start her tourist business, she decided together with her family to rehabilitate a heritage house in Quito's historic center. Silvana highlights the initiative programs given by Instituto Metropolitano de Patrimonio and market for rehabilitation of heritage houses. Emphasize that these programs are very beneficial since they are able to pay the loans starting to cover maintenance and rehabilitation projects over a 10-year period to property tax and without charges. The fourth axis of the Integral Development Plan proposes a transversal system for citizen interaction and participation through projects like a digital plan. In his speech, Jorge emphasizes the importance of defining strategies, alignments, and priorities like social organization mechanisms in order to improve the living conditions as well as the social, cultural, and human development opportunities for the people living in the historic center they Quito's Historic Center Integral Development Plan was made with the intention for benefiting not only the historic center, but Quito as a whole, with an inclusive, accessible, and safety-based vision for our World Heritage Site.
Thank you very much.
It brings back good memories to see those pictures, beautiful pictures of Quito, but it's also inspiring to see the work that is being done there to try to unlock and realize the potential for culture and heritage embedded in SDG 11.4 and in the New Urban Agenda to realize that potential in the neighborhoods of Quito. So thank you for that. And it's a good pivot now to our final panel of this program. We've heard a little bit now about the legacy of Habitat 3 and the New Urban Agenda in Quito, and now we're going to bring in colleagues from around the world to engage them in a discussion of the legacy of the New Urban Agenda globally. To do this, we've invited two colleagues to co-chair our final panel, and I'm happy to be able to introduce them to you. The first is Dr. Ege Yildirim, and Ege is joining us from Istanbul. Ege is a planner and independent expert and consultant working on projects around the world, but she also formerly was the focal point for sustainable development for the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And Ege herself was in Quito at Habitat 3. And Ege, I saw you in a number of those pictures, so I know how busy you were in those days. And Ege will be joined in sharing this session with architect Gabriel Caballero. Gabe is a landscape architect and working on projects as an expert around the world, including in his native Philippines and in Singapore, where he now lives. And Gabe is himself the current focal point for the International Council on Monuments and Sites for Sustainable Development. And so now, Ege and Gabe, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and ask you if you'll take us to our final panel of the event. Oh, and by the way, hopefully we will have time for some questions from the audience in this final segment. And so please, to the participants, attendees, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and hopefully Gabe and Ege will have time to ask some of them to our panelists. So Gabe and Ege, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, very well.
All right. Well, Gabe and I were planning to say welcome to you both. It's really interesting to have 3 generations of ICOMOS SDGs focal points here with you today, past, recent, past, and present. Maybe we'll have a future one. And so I'll just give Gabe a chance to say hello as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm calling from Singapore. It's almost midnight here, but I'm glad to be here with you.
Yes, we have a challenge coordinating different time zones around the world, but our motivation keeps us strong. So we have, as Andrew said, quite a varied, packed session before this event closes. And without further ado, I'll just outline how we're going to do this. I will provide a very general overview of the cultural and heritage components in the new urban agenda for you. Then Gabe will kindly moderate our esteemed panelists who are with us today, and then we'll try to take some Q&A and then hand it over to Andrew again. Well, I have to say that it's been really nostalgic to be here. You know, it's a blast from the past, and it's a wonderful occasion to revisit that amazing experience and see friends and colleagues. So I just have to say hello to you. Also to see pictures of that wonderful neighborhood, Vive Alameda. It transported us back in time, and actually I added a very funny picture to the first slide that you'll see in a moment now, that brings back memories. And lastly, I would like to pay a brief tribute again to another friend of cultural heritage, Mr. Osman Kavala from Turkey. He was the CEO of Anadolu Kültür. Actually, you saw a logo of Anadolu Kültür in one of Andrew's slides, and this NGO had funded my flight to Quito from Istanbul for Habitat 3. And I'm talking about Osman Bey today because he has been sentenced to a lifetime of imprisonment in Turkey last week because of the Gezi protests trial. I'm mentioning this to raise awareness and cultural rights and friends of cultural heritage. We shouldn't forget, everything is connected. And you know, this is as good a platform as any to mention this. Thank you so much about that. So now I will share the PowerPoint that will take us through the cultural heritage elements of the new urban agenda. So here you have a picture of a churro for you on the cover. One of the landmarks in Vive Alameda was the building called Churro, and I took this picture of an actual gastronomic churro at the airport in Quito and sent it to Denise. We had a good laugh that day, so a good memory there. And speaking of all kinds of cultural heritage, intangible, tangible, the new urban agenda actually starts with a strong statement in the preamble. One of the 10 paragraphs is about culture and cultural diversity, as you can see, talking about the enrichment for humankind, contribution to sustainable development, citizen empowerment, sustainable consumption and production patterns, responsible use of resources, which of course connects to climate action and climate change, which we could emphasize today for you. Then we are going through section by section, and most sections of the new urban agenda have some cultural heritage related clause, not all of them though. Andrew showed a critique of the effective means of implementation, for example, but in the principles and commitments in section 14C, we have mention of how lifestyles in harmony with nature, again, consumption, production, are emphasized here. It doesn't expressly say heritage, but today we know much better than 6 years ago that cultural heritage is directly connected with these themes, and we take every occasion to actually make these connections. There are 3 sections, A, B, C, which seem to correspond to the social, economic, and environmental aspect of sustainability that the new urban agenda has been structured around. So for the social inclusion and ending poverty part, we have one clause, section 38, talking about integrated urban and territorial policies and adequate investments at all levels. In the next, yes, in the section B, sustainable and inclusive urban prosperity and opportunities for all, we have section 45 talking about vibrant, sustainable, inclusive urban economies, building on endogenous potentials, competitive advantages, heritage and resources. Again, under prosperity in section 60, we talk about creation of decent jobs, promoting cultural and creative industries, including tourism, but also performing arts and heritage conservation activities. Then moving on to the environmental part, section 69 talks about preservation and promotion of the ecological and social function of land. It seems here also a slightly indirect reference in terms of phrasing, but again, very strong, obvious connections to cultural heritage. Then moving on to the effective implementation part, we have section 97, promote planned urban extensions and infill, prioritizing renewal, regeneration, and retrofitting of urban areas, slum upgrading, public spaces, participatory approaches, social inclusion again, avoiding segregation, and containing urban sprawl. Under planning and management, managing urban spatial development, again, we have section 124 talking about culture as a priority component of urban planning strategies, safeguarding a diverse range of tangible and intangible cultural heritage and landscapes, again, to protect from disruptive impacts of urban development. In section 125, we're seeing the revitalization of urban areas as a way to strengthen social participation and the exercise of citizenship. And that's it. We have done a very quick run through of the sections, which our panelists will delve into in more detail. So I will now hand over the floor to Gabe to moderate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ege. I think with the introduction earlier for the first hour and with Ege, looking back to Quito, I was not in Quito, but I've learned so much from it, and hearing from all the people that have discussed today, it seems that there's a lot of work that has been done, and I do hope that we can continue further and strengthen those connections and culture and heritage for the sustainable urban development. I'm very happy to be here to moderate and further learn from the experiences of our colleagues and what has happened at Quito and their own reflections to the future. So I have the pleasure of briefly introducing our speakers. So Antonia Gravagnolo, I hope that I pronounced it correctly, is a senior researcher at the Institute for Research and Innovation and Services for Development at the National Research Council in Italy. She was, I believe she was she was in Quito as well. I saw her picture there. The second speaker will be Shannon Miller. She's a historic preservation officer for the city of San Antonio in the USA and the director of the Office of Historic Preservation. And the third speaker will be Jordi Pascual, who's the coordinator for the Cultural Committee of the United Cities and Local Governments, or UCLG. And he's a geographer and a cultural manager based in Barcelona in Spain. And the fourth one is Christopher Rivet. He's the president of ICOMOS Canada and a trained archaeologist and heritage planner, and is a director for strategies for EVOC strategies in Canada. Now, Antonia will be taking us through on the section on promoting the ecological and social function of land, fostering ecosystem-based solutions to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Antonia, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you. I want to thank so much the organizers, Andrew, and also all the friends and colleagues that I see today. So 6 years ago, I was in Quito. I was involved in the Alameda project, and it was amazing. I was a very young researcher, and this experience was really paving my way as a researcher. So let me go directly to the presentation. I have some few slides. I think you can see it. Okay, so I would focus now on a specific argument, a specific topic on promoting the ecological and social function of land, fostering ecosystem-based solutions for sustainable cities. So since 2016 in Quito, many things happened and the world has also changed. And many research and innovation activities have been conducted worldwide, and I would focus a little bit on some activities that I was involved in, both as ICOMOS member, but also as a researcher in Italy. Just let me focus, as Ege was already introducing, some chapters, some sections of the new urban agenda, which highlight the role of culture and cultural heritage as endogenous resources for the sustainable city. So the new urban agenda was very forward-looking at the time and was highlighting in some aspects what role cultural heritage can have for having sustainable cities. Sorry.
give Antonia a couple of minutes. I think she just needed to answer the phone for a bit.
Okay, sorry, I'm here again. Sorry. Quickly, I go on to highlight also another aspect that was mentioned is in the New Urban Agenda regarding circular economy implementation in sustainable cities and how to go towards also human-centered city model. So here cultural heritage can have really a big role. And here I want also to focus on a topic that was mentioned at the time, but after 6 years we can see really the importance of ecosystem health also for human health. And we are coming out slowly from 2 years of pandemic, and we have seen really how important is to maintain healthy ecosystems also in urban areas where almost half of the population lives and more people will live. So to ensure that human health is also fostered, we need to also take care of ecosystem health, which are two interconnected aspects. So going from a linear model of urban development, which is based on resources extraction, use and waste, we need to go towards more circular urban economies, more circular metabolism in cities. And this is touching some aspects such as energy self-sufficiency, circular reuse of all kinds of wastes, which can be also waste of land and waste of human resources, human capital. So the research in the last year has focused a lot on how cultural heritage and especially abandoned or underused cultural heritage can really have a role to contribute to well-being of people, of communities, and for the reuse of abandoned, underused heritage sites, as it was also mentioned today. So the cultural heritage can really give a contribution also to interpret this green and circular city from a waste-centric and technological-centric perspective to a human-centric perspective, where heritage, culture, and humans are at the center. So the New Urban Agenda was also highlighting how to prevent unnecessary land use change, which is one aspect of urbanization and of development of cities and regions that can really focus on circularity and on the reuse of land in a sustainable way. This means also reusing heritage sites, cultural landscapes in a way that ensures ecosystem services provision and especially also cultural ecosystem services. So to regenerate urban ecosystems, but also rural ecosystems and cultural landscapes, nature-based solutions can be employed, and there are a lot of research and innovation projects also focusing on this aspect, and this can be implemented also in heritage sites towards cultural, creative, beautiful, and also healthy and self-sufficient cities, focusing also on the aspect of energy self-sufficiency, which is becoming more and more important every day today. So here, just to mention some projects, I was involved in a couple of them, and some of them are still ongoing. These projects were coming out after the 2016 and after the New Urban Agenda was issued and discussed. And these projects are really implementing also the ideas of the New Urban Agenda, especially related on cultural heritage and which role this can have to realize a circular and creative and healthy cities, resilient, safe, and sustainable, as we know. So policy action has also grown in the last year. Here are some examples from Europe, from European perspective, as I'm working in Europe. But many different policies have been implemented also in other countries. So I would focus also on the new European Bauhaus initiative in Europe, which is focusing on beautiful, sustainable, and community-based, people-centered cities. And on one other initiative of ICOMOS and Europa Nostra, which is the European Cultural Heritage Green Paper, which helps policymakers to introduce cultural heritage more effectively into the Green Deal policies and into the green cities and circular cities policies. So the role of cultural heritage in these kind of policies can still be strengthened, can still be explored. It is not the end, but I would say it is the start of a journey here. We see also the urban agenda as it was interpreted in Europe with a partnership on culture and cultural heritage dedicated to it, and with another partnership on circular economy, which can go together. And let me conclude very quickly with a small example in a city of Italy, in southern Italy. The city is Salerno. It was included in one of the projects in which I was involved, which is Horizon 2020 CLIC project led by Professor Luigi Fusco-Girard. And in this city, through a lot of activities of collaboration and participation of diverse stakeholders, more than 50 organizations were involved. The city has developed a circular city plan, and it has called it a circular city of health. Because it is linked to tangible and intangible cultural heritage, which is very important in the place, which is the Salernitana Medical School. So here again to link these different aspects that are very much interlinked and connected together. So that's all. Thank you very much, and sorry for the interruption before.
Thank you very much, Antonia. I think you hit it right in the head. The nature-based solutions are very much important, and energy and self-sufficiency is also a trend that needs to be discussed. I think we can move ahead, and if you have questions for Antonia, please put it in the chat. I will go to Shannon Miller's discussion, she will be discussing about the quality, decent and productive jobs, including through the promotion of cultural and creative industries, sustainable tourism, performing arts, and heritage conservation activities. Shannon, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. And you can hear me and see my screen?
Yes, we can hear you. And
great, just wanted to make sure. All right, well, thank you everyone for having me today. It's my pleasure to be with you. I'm the director of the Office of Historic Preservation in San Antonio. And OHP has been working to perpetuate the living heritage of San Antonio through trades education for over a decade. Most recently with the launch of our Living Heritage Trades Academy, which teaches traditional skills as well as deconstruction under the direction of skilled master craftsmen. And I think for this reason, plus the fact that I was fortunate enough to be in Quito for Habitat 3, I was invited to reflect on the inclusion of quality and decent and productive jobs related to heritage in the New Urban Agenda. Sorry, didn't advance there. And so, you know, this is captured, you can see on the screen, this was captured in the New Urban Agenda number 60. And, you know, it speaks to the importance of the promotion of cultural and creative industries and sustainable tourism, performing arts, and heritage conservation activities as it relates to workforce development. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about how this has really played out in San Antonio. Workforce development is a significant priority for our mayor and for our city council. Last year, our citizens actually voted to approve a $200 million ballot initiative that funds the San Antonio Ready to Work initiative with a 1/8 cent sales tax. This program is really a one-of-a-kind program to help residents find access to education and to quality jobs and other benefits, including tuition, support services, emergency funding, and then eventually job placement services. And it's open to really any resident in San Antonio that's over the age of 18 and is permitted to work in the United States and is really shows a commitment to completing the program. And what's special about it is that it connects with employers to ensure that that when participants go through the program, that not only do they get the training, but they also have hiring partners at the end that are committed to filling positions with people who have completed the program. And so I mention all of that so that then I can speak in the context of some of our heritage workforce development initiatives that we've been working on. We have been working for many years, as I mentioned at the outset, in the Living Heritage arena. We've been hosting Living Heritage Symposium. Several of the people on this call, on this Zoom today, have been speakers at one of our symposiums in the past, Ege and Andrew and others. And many of our kind of workforce development initiatives and other important programs out of our office have come from what we've learned at the Living Heritage Symposium. We started in 2010 with an event that was called STAR, which stands for Students Together Achieving Revitalization. STAR really works to arrest the deterioration of San Antonio's historic housing stock through service learning opportunities for architecture and construction science students. And then we expanded that to Rehaborama, which really opens the opportunity for volunteers that are not just students, so any volunteers. And sometimes it's contractors that want to learn new skills and learn how to work on rehabbing historic homes. So from those programs, we launched the Living Heritage Trades Academy, and we work with local partners through the Trades Academy to actually host students to learn not just a one day or a weekend type of training, but to have real workforce level training where they can come out and they're hireable at the end. You know, I like to point out that in San Antonio and in many cities around the country, around the world, the biggest things that we're facing are workforce development challenges, climate challenges, and affordable housing challenges. And those things are so interrelated because we can really utilize workforce development opportunities to reinvest in our affordable housing. And we also can, you know, there's no way that we're going to meet climate goals, we all know, without addressing existing buildings and reinvesting in our existing infrastructure. And so they're also interrelated, and that's a very important part of our programming. So our traditional trades training is really about teaching students the old ways of building and the ability to repair existing structures rather than demolishing and building new. And we know that San Antonio has a heritage of talented and skilled practitioners, but those skills can be lost, and they are being lost. Many studies have shown that half of traditional tradespeople are over the age of 45. And so a looming shortage of contractors who have experience working with historic building materials and who understand the importance of maintaining the unique characteristics local to San Antonio is a huge concern and a climate heritage concern. With a well-stocked pool of traditional trade practitioners, historic preservation building owners have increased access to affordable alternatives to the removal of materials or demolition of existing buildings. Our traditional trades efforts are important to climate action in many ways, including disaster recovery and pre-recovery. It's also directly connected to advancing the circular economy, which is one of our community mitigation strategies outlined in our city's climate action plan. The circular economy not only eliminates negative environmental impacts and creates new source of value, but also can be used to bridge the wealth divide and create new pathways for upper mobility. And so you can see from a lot of these photos, these students are learning really hands-on. They're in an apprenticeship for 10 weeks. They get safety training. They're connected to other training opportunities and resources so that they can really be successful and come out on the other end with productive and high-paying skilled jobs. There's an example of some of the work that they've done, a house that they are helping to restore. This is a before and an after of one of the learning labs that we use through the Trades Academy. One of the other aspects of our program and our workforce development initiatives are tied to our deconstruction initiative. In deconstruction, it's not really about if a building is going to come down. We know that there are some buildings that are going to come down, but it's really about how the building comes down. And we like to talk about it in terms of an organ donor mentality. If structure cannot be saved intact, then its parts and pieces could help extend the lives of dozens of other historic structures. Instead of going to buy completely new products to replace damaged or missing materials, a material reuse industry allows historic building stewards to source period appropriate materials to sustain their structures. And so, deconstruction also touches on a number of other important priorities, such as public health and sustainability and waste reduction. But most importantly for the conversation today is workforce. We've focused a lot of attention on training a workforce. We know that deconstruction employs 6 times more people than mechanical demolition. And so it's important from that aspect as well. And part of this initiative also includes the development of a materials innovation center, which is really intended to be the last stop before the landfill for materials that come out of projects as buildings are hopefully being deconstructed. And then we can use that material and work with researchers to develop other jobs that reuse materials in new and innovative ways. We also believe that this is an important aspect of affordable housing, protection and production, and then pre-disaster mitigation. I've touched on a number of these things. We also have a study that we did called Treasure in the Walls that looks at the benefit of deconstruction and what it can do in terms of protecting the environment. And I mentioned a connection earlier to our affordable housing. We know that older and historic buildings disproportionately provide affordable housing in our community. And so it's important that through our workforce development, we're reinvesting in those affordable housing units. With that, I would like to show a very brief 2-minute video, and that will be the end of my presentation. Let me share my screen. Okay, it's not letting me share audio, so I guess I won't be able to show you the video, but it's a little video about, I can put the link I'll put the link to it in the chat. I'm sorry about that, but it's just a nice video that highlights the importance of workforce in reuse and deconstruction and adaptive reuse. So I will put the link in the chat. Sorry about that. And I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Shannon. I think your intervention was very good. I think there are also a lot of questions, 2 questions that are related to finances, and maybe you can answer them. But the work of the City of San Antonio in creating the program for people to learn skills and training and empowerment really is a great thing to do. And you mentioned also climate change and skills training is something that needs to be seen together, which is, I think, something that we should really look into in great detail. I will move on to the third speaker so that we can catch with the time. Jordi Pascual is going to be discussing with you about the strengthening social participation and the exercise of citizenship, stimulating participation and responsibility. Jordi, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabe. Ege. Thank you very much also, Andrew, for this opportunity. I'm invited to build on paragraph 38 and paragraph 125. Paragraph 38 says that we commit ourselves to the sustainable leveraging of natural and cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, in cities and human settlements, as appropriate, through integrated urban and territorial policies and adequate investments at the national, subnational, and local levels to safeguard and promote cultural infrastructures and sites, museums, indigenous cultures and languages, as well as traditional knowledge and the arts, highlighting the role that these play in rehabilitating and revitalizing urban areas and in strengthening social participation and the exercise of citizenship. This is one of the first commitments of the new urban agenda. One of the first commitments under transformative commitments for sustainable urban development. On the contrary, 125, paragraph 125 is one of the last. In fact, it's the last in the effective implementation chapter. And the paragraph 125 says, we will support the leveraging of cultural heritage for sustainable urban development and recognize its role in stimulating participation and responsibility. We will promote innovative and sustainable use of architectural monuments and sites with the intention of value creation through respectful restoration and adaptation. We will engage indigenous peoples and local communities in the promotion and dissemination of knowledge of tangible and intangible cultural heritage and protection of traditional expressions and languages, including through the use of new technologies and techniques. All in all, I think that the wording of what I am invited to develop is a good wording, strengthening social participation and the exercise of citizenship, stimulating participation and responsibility. I believe that much has reigned after the 2016 new urban agenda, 6 years, but 6 years in which we have experienced at least four very important processes. The first one, of course, is COVID-19, and the measures of the governments. The crisis could have been unbearable without cultural practices, without the work done by cultural actors in the past during the pandemic. It has been a massive exercise of new social engineering, and citizens have understood that culture cannot be culture in cities, cultural policies in cities is not an option. It has become fundamental for citizens all around the world to be full members of the society. So this is the first one, interesting evidence. The second one is the feminist revolution. The new urban agenda is not ambitious enough. If we had to write it again today, all the achievements of the feminist activists would have taken a good portion of the paragraphs and the wording. And of course, this revolution has consequences that go beyond the cultural sector, but also in the cultural sector. The heritage we celebrate is predominantly masculine, our monuments, our intangible heritage festivities. This is under analysis all over the world. And it is something that we cities and local governments, we celebrate a lot. And we also say push for new masculinities, for new understanding of our gender, to be understood, to be reworked, to be reshaped. Third is climate emergency, and I must say it's this generation, my generation. I was born in 1968. It is this generation that has consolidated the Anthropocene. In the 1980s, we had already the evidences that the growth, the economic growth was not sustainable. The Club of Rome and the Meadows Report, and of course in 1987, Brundtland Report and the Rio +20, but we kept as if nothing was happening. And this struggle today is the front page. Again, cities and local governments are adapting. This adaptation cannot take place unless there is real social engagement, real social participation in cities, neighborhoods, districts, and cultural policies also need to adapt to this situation. Cultural centers, museums, auditoriums, festivals, the audiences, we need to take serious measures to mitigate and to adapt to these new, very difficult times we are heading. And last one is the colonial. And this is, I know this exercise is very difficult, but this is something that we have to seriously consider in the 21st century. Black Lives Matter marked a point of inflection in, again, strengthening social participation and the exercise of citizenship, not only in the United States and the United Kingdom, but everywhere these debates are taking place. The discussions on what we celebrate and how, what we keep in our museums and what is the origin of this heritage. This is growing as a matter of interest of citizenship. And it is one of the issues that, if we want a fair globalization to take place, we have to seriously analyze and take commitments. I will finish. If you wish to perhaps know more on what we in United Cities and local governments, what we have written on the feminist revolution and gender equality and culture, Farida Shahid wrote a wonderful report in September, in December last year, we published it. And on climate resilient development and culture, Andrew Potts with us wrote a wonderful report published in December last year also. I will copy and paste the links to both reports. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordi. I think you've given some good thoughts as well on the heritage and gender question that we need to push further. And I think it is really not in the new urban agenda. And this course on decolonization is another topic that recently came out. And again, climate, you've also highlighted. And of course, COVID. Good points to discuss later on if there's time. We have one more person to speak, and we have Christophe Rivet, and he will be covering the topic of sustainable, dense, low carbon, inclusive land use and territorial planning, including the upgrading of slums and informal, while preserving cultural heritage. Christophe, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Gabriel. Buenos dias a todos. Bonjour à tous. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and what a wonderful opportunity to go down memory lane with many of you. We had spent that time in Quito many years ago, and it is so strange to see thousands of people together, maskless, and having fun and exchanging ideas. So it is a treat for me to be with you today. I was invited to speak to a fairly broad topic, and today one of the things is that when you arrive last and you're one of the last presenters, so many good things were said before you. So I'm going to try to build on that. And one particular element is the emphasis that all the previous speakers have put on people. So that's a pretty critical to the commentary that I'll be making. But the other aspect is that I've been asked to reflect on sustainability, dense, low carbon, inclusive land use and territorial planning, which really captures, in essence, what the NUA is trying to achieve. So it's a planner's document that gives a vision of how cities should develop. But the bigger question that we have to ask ourselves is that, is it really giving us the tools to deal with change in the historic environment? And we had a wonderful commentary from our colleague Eduardo Rojas a few minutes ago on the HUL and how that's an effective tool to explore that. But my commentary today, and it's really a series of observations rather than definitive conclusions, is to highlight whether the NUA does provide those tools to address change in a historic environment. So I'll say a few words about the NUA and change in historic environments based on those sections. I'll also talk about how historic environments, urban environments are transitioning right now. I'll put a spotlight on some of the conflict and complementarity between sustainability and heritage conservation. As Andrew mentioned earlier, when we met in Quito, it was a moment of great ebullient discussion around sustainability, climate change adaptation, culture, and all sorts of things that all came together. And as we move forward in heritage preservation these days, all of this is one package. In fact, it's difficult to dissociate those realities. And you'll notice that in my commentary, in fact, it may move from the SDGs to the NUA to those various tools without explicitly naming them. But that's one conclusion of all that effort that was done in the mid-2010. 20-teens, it's how all these ideas crystallize in multiple realities. And then I'll conclude by offering you a few thoughts on how, from my experience, the definitive challenge in applying the NUA and even the SDGs is a challenge of interpretation, an interpretation of that direction. And I'll try to share the why of that interpretation, why I'm thinking about that question, based on a pilot that we did in Winnipeg here in Canada. So many of my examples will be Canadian, but I think that's the point of today's conversation, is to share. So in terms of the new urban agenda, it both incorporates and skirts considerations of heritage environments, and it does so directly and indirectly, and especially as it addresses densification and renewal. And the reason why I'm saying that is that the different sections will sometimes emphasize, sometimes reduce the attention to cultural matters. Sometimes it will complement previous sections. Sometimes it might be interpreted as contradictory. But I've been asked to pay attention to these four sections in particular, and I think the essence of each one of these sections might help highlight the case that I'm making. So the first one focuses on prioritizing urban renewal, and it talks about the integration of new neighborhoods into the urban fabric. So the reason why I found that section intriguing is that it puts that emphasis on renewal, talks about the integration of something new into existing urban fabric. but doesn't recognize that urban fabric, the existing urban fabric, in fact, has a historic or at least heritage dimension to it. So this is one particular circumstance where I think it doesn't quite fully incorporate that logic. The second section I've been asked to look at is to preserve and promote ecological and social function of land. And the particular element here is that if the priority is to recognize the ecosystems that surround their urban environments as functionally contributing to the reality of the city, then it displaces the question of where do we put people into a cultural environment. So this is where we put that highlight, or this is an opportunity to highlight that potential friction between ecosystem preservation and recognizing that function towards an urban environment and the cultural dimension that exists within an urban environment. The third section focuses on prioritizing renewal, regeneration, and retrofitting. And that's a pretty critical idea in an agenda that's called the New Urban Agenda, because it emphasizes the need to address the basic requirements of community life, which is to have access to housing, which is to have access to places of work, and so on and so forth. But the thrust is to focus on this idea of renewal and regeneration and retrofitting, as if we are reaching a point of where things have reached their end of life. And it's particularly intriguing when that section concludes with, while preserving cultural heritage and preventing and containing urban sprawl. So it's tacking together a bunch of ideas that are not easily reconcilable. And this is another point of friction that I wanted to highlight. And lastly, the section 124 addresses the planning aspect of things. So culture as a priority component of plans. And this really echoes what Francesco Banderin was introducing to us earlier about the UNESCO initiatives that flipped the conversation to start with culture, as opposed to looking at urban fabric in a detached way. And this is a section that really creates that clear bridge with UNESCO's initiative and ours, of course. So putting culture as a priority component of plans in order to safeguard a diverse range of tangible and intangible cultural heritage and landscapes, and to protect them from potential disruptive impacts of urban development. So I want to contrast that section with the first section I introduced, which prioritizes urban renewal. So this is again one of those examples where I think the New Urban Agenda is establishing some of those basic principles of how to handle an urban environment without necessarily providing those clear pointers towards solution. So let's have a quick look at what it means to be in a historic urban environment. So these environments are in transition. They've always been in transition, but particularly today, when you look at a global picture, you're realizing that cities are the target of human transformation, and this is putting pressure on historic environments. So across the globe, these urban environments are under pressure from migrations, climate change, economic disparities, social tensions. And historic environments are particularly susceptible to these because that's where you find existing infrastructure. So it becomes a target for people to go to find those needs for housing and so on. There's also a contrast in terms of these historic environments where some of them are affordable because they are much more organically lived in. I don't particularly like the expression slums, but there's often a correlation of those spaces with those environments that are that are challenging. But others are pretty exclusive. And here I chose these two pictures to give you a bit of that contrast. Both of them are historic environments, but I can assure you that the affordability of the neighborhood in the picture at the bottom is essentially nil. It's a high-end historic environment. All of these historic environments require some level of adaptation to climate change, but as we saw with some of the previous speakers, it does depend on how you address the question. So if you do focus on elements of circular economy, for example, that help addressing carbon emissions, well, that level of adaptation may be gauged as lower compared to new environments. But if we're talking about energy efficiency, then the challenge of rendering these spaces more energy efficient might be gauged as higher compared to new environments. There are also complex social and cultural environments. There's a mix of people that evolve in those spaces, and that creates quite specific planning challenges for cities and so on. And in fact, because they're more mature environments, because they've been around for much longer, because there's such a flux of realities and people, they typically have their own economic and social ecosystems that makes it difficult to just intervene and propose absolute planning tools to manage change. So in order to put a bit of spotlight on the conflict and complement between sustainability and heritage conservation, I wanted to put shine a bit of light on what happened in the past. And the reason why I'm doing that is because some of the language that we are invited to use in the NUA can be interpreted in ways that hark back to the ills of progress versus heritage preservation. So I wanted to put a bit of a spotlight on that. Some of the conflict, when we talk about renewal and integration, can very well lead us to destruction. And same with affordable housing strategies, it may very well lead us to prioritize the need to put a roof on people's head versus creating communities. And we have some examples here in Montreal, at the top, Faubourg Alameda, which was a thriving workers' neighborhood that was razed to the ground in order to build government infrastructure. And we went from a place where you had many people hanging out around markets to a single individual sitting on a bench. And that I find is a very stimulating contrast. And the pictures at the bottom, the four ones, it's to contrast life as a community versus the aspirations of a planner's vision of how things should be done. This is a community in Nova Scotia, Halifax, Nova Scotia, in the Eastern Seaboard, traditional African Nova Scotian community since the 1800s. It was deemed a slum in the 60s, and the activities of the city, the vision for the city was to demolish the neighborhood. People were forcibly removed and invited to find a home in affordable housing that was built by the city. And here we are 50 years later, descendants of those residents asking for justice and reparations in the face of that. So that disconnect between planning and culture has led to much ill. But there are some elements of complement, and I'm almost finished on that picture. But the complement is that there is an opportunity when we look at the sustainability parameters and heritage conservation to put an emphasis on strong and sustainable communities, particularly if we build on those ecosystems of how these communities function. Second element is that there is, when we look at heritage preservation and sustainability question, if we look at it at the citywide challenges, then we will be able to introduce heritage preservation as an element of solution towards waste reduction, for example, and carbon emissions. These historic environments offer an opportunity to leverage the economic value of culture, which non-heritage environments are probably going to be, are generally challenged to do. I'm sorry, these bullets were duplicated from somewhere else. You can tell where I got the slide. So I'll just jump to this example before I come to my conclusion. This example was, this is a pilot that was carried out in Winnipeg, Manitoba. This is a community called the Exchange District. It's the neighborhood. It is the largest concentration of turn of the century architecture in Canada and the second in North America after Chicago. It is tied to the economic boom of the 1900s to 1930s. So you can imagine this kind of very rich, ornate architecture, tall buildings, offices, storage, and so on and so forth. And it all came to a standstill after the crash of 1929. And since then, there's been various initiatives to transform that space. Now, over time, the city itself has changed. Where we started with this building stock with a business environment that originated from Eastern Canada. So imagine money, trade, wealthy individuals, and individuals from colonial environments. We are now facing a city that has primarily a young population that is indigenous, a thriving immigrant community. So these cultural realities and economic realities are in contrast to the nature of the heritage we're working with. So in terms of this project and pilot project, the objective was to try to reconcile the evolution of the city with the heritage dimension of that particular neighborhood. And this is where the project was to create a blueprint to build that. We have one example here at the bottom, which is a college that was transformed for the local community, which integrates both indigenous artistic expressions with the traditional architecture that emanated from the turn of the century. So to conclude, the NUA in general sets a direction for potential tensions as opposed to harmonious solutions. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that at least we've observed here in implementing. The second element is that it does offer, nevertheless, principles that can help guide solutions, but they need to be interpreted. And many of these principles are planning oriented, which does lead to the potential reiteration of what we've lived in previous generations, so in the 60s. And I've asked myself, is sustainability the new modernity? So whereas in the 60s, we were pushing for modernity over and progress over the existent fabric and communities, is sustainability leading us possibly towards that same logic? And lastly, the lens to interpret a sustainable approach that includes cultural heritage is based on people. And I think we've heard it from many of the speakers before. This is about culture, it's about social interactions, economic diversity, and inclusion. And I'll finish by suggesting that there are perhaps two key ideas and principles we need to reconcile in approaching these questions. First one is well-being, what it means to be part of something, comfortable, safe, and engaged. And the second element is human rights. Every single activity that we've seen in the past where progress met heritage preservation led to a challenge to human rights. And we are now, I think, even more conscious than ever of the importance of these rights, of diversity, of inclusion, and so on. And I would like to suggest that perhaps the tensions that are crafted in the NUA, and even to a certain extent the SDGs, we have to be mindful of those tensions as potentially challenging the universal human rights we're trying to protect. That's what I wanted to position and offer for today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I think it's also a good perspective and a good critique to the new urban agenda. And I think that issue of well-being, human rights is something that we need to think about. And indeed, the cities are complex and they're susceptible to a lot of different changes that are happening. What I will do now is that I will give the floor to Ege so that she can ask at least one or two questions, and we will hand it back to Andrew afterwards. I apologize for our viewers who are here. We're a little bit over time. Ege, to you, please.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you to all our panelists. Now we are at 1/2 of the hour, but if everybody allows, we can spill over perhaps 10 more minutes max, in which we will try to address the questions, because there are actually 5 questions. People do want to ask questions, and then we'll have Andrew to wrap up. He said he doesn't need too much time, but we'll try to finish by 40 past. So actually, what I suggest, and Gabe and I were discussing our strategy about this, we understand that climate change is one bridging factor of some of the questions. And what seems a practical way is I would like to give you all the 5 questions we have. And each panelist, you can freely perhaps merge your answers and give one consolidated answer to the questions of your choosing with your chosen emphasis on them. So we'll have a round of, about 1.5 minutes if you can, from each panelist. So I will read out the questions. I was also trying to copy and paste them to the chat box. I might manage in a moment, but let me first remind everybody, you already saw them in the Q&A mostly. But let's go. So Carl Elefante has been talking about how so much of development is driven by financial considerations. How are cultural heritage advocates building bridges to the financial sector? What are the key points of connection, the barriers in this connection? Christina Garzillo has asked what skills at risk are identified. How do you, she asks this to Shannon in particularly, how do you integrate traditional skills with modern ones, digital environment, etc. Ella Caleta from UN Habitat, she talks about how this was already touched on in different presentations, but could you kindly elaborate on the challenges associated with combining preservation of intangible culture and heritage with nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation and mitigation? Patricia Elaine Green has thanked Jordi, and he seems to address her question to him. This is key for colonialism. This is key for issues of inclusion and diversity. How do we interpret the historic urban landscape as inclusive of all before and after colonial occupation? Patricia Elaine has also talked about SIDS, small island developing states, and how that is integrated in the new urban agenda. So hopefully, Antonia, I hope you have a good memory, or you can browse the questions while I try to copy paste for your convenience the 5 questions. Please, let's have your interpretation of the general feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ege, and thanks also to the participants for the questions. So if I may, I would answer to Ella Caleta regarding the role of intangible culture and heritage and the challenges with integration of nature-based solutions. With an example about skills, traditional skills in cultural heritage and especially cultural landscape. For example, the art of dry stone wall making, which is an intangible heritage inscribed into the UNESCO list. Is actually a way of integrating nature and which can be called a nature-based solution into landscape making, into cultural landscape. So of course there are challenges when we want to integrate this into the contemporary world. I mean, it is very much linked to the recognition of the value of these traditional skills and the value of the landscape making in a traditional sense. So this kind of work is not much searched by today's contemporary communities, but it has value, and when we recognize it, and when we recognize also the ecosystem services linked to this kind of intangible heritage, this connection can be easier, let's say. So I would strengthen this aspect just to quickly answer one of the questions.
Great, thank you, Antonia. Sorry to cut you off. I'll have to quickly move on to our next panelists for their response, and that would be Shannon. You have some specifics for you anyway.
Yes, sure. So just to answer the question about what skills at risk that we identified, I mean, we are focused specifically on like traditional like carpentry skills, building skills, and then also deconstruction. It sounds a little bit funny, but you know, like when you were a little kid and you took something apart and put it back together, you really understood how it works. It's sort of the concept of deconstruction. You take the building back apart the opposite way it went up. And so it really helps people understand those skills. But in terms of integrating those skills with modern skills, I think that's really important. And that's what we're trying to accomplish through the Material Innovation Center. Looking at, some materials will be able to be reused as is, but others won't be. And so how can we find new uses and new ways to sort of repurpose? So I'll stop there because I know we're tight on time.
Okay, thank you very much, Shannon. Jordi, please.
Yes, no, yeah, fully agree with what Patricia Lane Green says. Indeed, not easy thing, but let's do it. And also, I forgot to mention, but human rights at the center, as Christophe was convincingly arguing. The alternative is just impossible. We have to struggle for that and keep human rights at the center. No other frame guarantees freedoms. And even if we are in difficulties, even if strong players go in the other direction, we keep defending, promoting, and protecting human rights.
I have to agree there. Just having been through an example, we have to keep our spirits strong, definitely. Dear Jordi, if you're finished, I will just note that Eduardo would like to add something, but Eduardo, if this is on the decolonialism and rights issue, please, if you can hold your thought, I'll go through the panelists of this section and then take your remark, if that's all right. So we have Christophe next, so I'll just ask Christophe if he has remarks on any of these questions.
I mean, not particularly considering the richness of the discussions that occurred, but I think what I was trying to demonstrate in my observations is really how when you look at how everything collides, it doesn't necessarily always jive. And part of our effort is to find a common framework of what seems to be valuable to pursue, and the concept of well-being, the concept of pursuing human rights have to be core. Otherwise, we might repeat what has been done in the past.
Mm-hmm. Taking lessons from our history. Here, I'd like to switch to Eduardo. Would you like to add on to this now?
No, I was reacting to Carl's observation about the financial sector involvement on this thing. Just a couple of points. One, there is no free lunch. So if we preserve, somebody has to pay. And the governments can't pay for everything. So it had to be a collective effort. The whole society had to be there. For that, we have to share the values, and then we are prepared to commit ourselves. And that's what probably in many ways, the Alameda project showed that people were willing to get involved. Now, how much they can put is essentially another issue, but when they're together, things work much better than we are relying only on the government to do everything. That's it.
Yeah, actually, I mean, we are out of time, but if I may just add 15 seconds, in World Urban Forum 10, the last one in Abu Dhabi, our friend from ICOMOS, Donovan Ripkama, made a fantastic presentation on how much we need private sector investment to support public finance as well, just to solidify that argument. So thank you so much.
Just one element to say, Elgin, that private sector means everybody. We are all private sector, but the government. And that's community and everything. It's not only investors, it's everybody.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Great. No, it's really great to have Eduardo's, teachings. So really thank you for being here. Okay, now it's time to slowly close, and I will hand over to dear Andrew Potts for this wonderful session's closing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ege and Gabe, and thank you to all the panelists. Those interventions were fantastic. I'm going to quickly close since we are over time, not slowly. And first, just to thank the Van Allen Institute here in Brooklyn for hosting the physical dimension of our meeting, to thank all of our speakers, to thank the participants who joined us, many of whom have stayed with us, even though we are now over time. It's a compliment to our speakers, I think. And just to conclude, by saying this, even today in 2022, and certainly in 2016, it was the case that culture and heritage, its role in sustainability and urbanism often goes unacknowledged. Sometimes we're missing from planning and processes. Our role is misunderstood. Going into 2016, we had no real international consensus document approved by all the national governments of the world that we could point to and say, we belong here. We have a key role in this topic. After Quito, we had that document. We have the New Urban Agenda, a consensus better practices document approved by all the countries of the world, and it unequivocally, loudly says that culture and heritage belong here. And now we can take that document and use it to take a seat at the table whenever it's not otherwise offered. And so that's a contribution of Quito and the New Urban Agenda that benefits us all, and that for which I will forever be thankful. Now, even in Quito, even in October 2016, we knew the treatment of the topics of culture and heritage was incomplete in the New Urban Agenda. And of course, in the years that have followed, needs, demands, research, knowledge have changed those baselines. We've already heard in this session critiques about the need for robust engagement with transformative climate action, gender equality, decolonization. These are all topics that we would surely want to see treated differently today than they were in 2016. It's a living document, a living process. The people, the speakers we've heard from, and many in the audience are engaged every day in these processes to unlock the potential of culture and heritage for sustainable places, cities, and human settlements. And it's just been an inspiration to hear more about that, even while we know there's so much more to be done. So I thank you all for joining us. I thank you for the work that you're doing. I look forward to seeing some of you in Katowice, Poland in a few weeks at World Urban Forum 11, the next event of UN Habitat, the original sponsor of Habitat 3. Thank you to our friends in Quito, especially, and to our colleagues in Barrios Alameda, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.